So the end of Torah focuses on the flows, biological flows that can come from both men and women. In a woman, the menstrual flow of blood, and the fact that that blood can come even for days at a time, not as part of the regular, what we call the regular period. And within men too, there's the flow of semen, and then there could be maybe something similar to gonorrhea, but an unnatural, maybe even an unhealthy flow that comes not often unwillingly that can come from a man, similar to the idea of a flow of semen. Now, even though these are very seemingly very biological, there is quite a bit of focus beyond just the laws of them. The fact that there is Torah focus on the human capacity and desire for intimacy, what we call sexual intimacy, and that as hallowed as that can be and should be, and as advocated as that is in Torah literature, there is certainly space there for self-gratification, self-focus, and it's something that these areas, even if they aren't necessarily in every case, aren't a woman's menstruation has nothing to do with their personal intimacy or the days or whatever it is, their patterns. But since biologically there's obviously a connection there, just in the bodily parts and so on. This is something that there's focus on there. There's halachic focus, but it resonates also more because this is something that dates back to the Garden of Eden. That the original sin, as we see in the Garden of Eden, so the gods created Adam, and Adam being an androgynous being. Then God split Adam into two, a man and a woman, and they have Adam and Chava. This man and woman, they live in God's world, and they live an idyllic reality, and including the pleasures of the world. The pleasures of the world are their being able to enjoy God's world and totally conscious of the fact that it's God's world and that they are created by God into being humanly conscious, but humanly conscious agents of the divine. And they're given one mitzvah, which is not to eat from a tree in the Garden of Eden. And although there are many other trees, they have plenty to eat. So where the big wrinkle came in was where it says that Chava saw the fruit and says that it was luscious to the eyes. That is the beginning of the problem. The beginning of the problem is that she saw in it what it would do for her. She saw in it her own self-gratification. It was luscious to the eyes. This is going to taste good. Whereas before that, the way they were more wired was to see within the fruit that this is something that God created, and God created for a purpose, and the purpose may very well be for me to enjoy on a Shabbos or whatever it is, for me to use it for my nutrition. But it was within that context. If it tasted good, it was within the context of this is God's world. I am God's agent, and my use of the world is in the parameters how God wants me to and why God created it. And we don't just pull out that this is going to taste good. So the fact that they went forward and ate it and so on, it stemmed. That's the soul of that problem, was the sense of search for self-gratification, and in a way really denigrating the real purpose, which is that it's about God, not about their gratification. So where there is self-gratification, there is, that resonates. And that's a big a big distraction for human beings. And we're told that that is when Chava began to menstruate, that this is what the idea that there would be this cycle. And the fact is that when God told him that consequences would be, it says that to her, she said she would be able to have the beauty of giving birth to a child, which is amazing. It's giving birth to a child is being on par with God creating another human being, and it's a beautiful gift. But that she would have the pain of childbirth. In other words, the pleasures would not come as seamlessly as they did when totally connected with God, but there would be no pain, no gain. And similarly, the Adam has said that you'd be able to earn a living and be able to, therefore, you through that access to the pleasures of the world, but earning a living is not going to be so simple. Again, the pain comes before the gain. So the ideas that we're going to read here, some of these are still applicable in the sense that women still menstruate, and there are still guidelines for how they impact the Torah's view as appropriate times for physical intimacy between husband and wife, which are based on the menstrual cycle. With men, it's not as it's less so, but we have also discussed that at the times of the temple, this was very important, because whenever either a man had seen the flow of semen or a woman had seen the flow of her blood, there would be guidelines for when they would be allowed to partake of sacred foods or go into the temple precincts and so on. That stuff doesn't exist now. For a woman, it will guide her physical intimacy, and for men, there is a practice to go to the mikveh, but that's not so much halacha. It's not so fixed in Jewish law. Okay, but before we go to do 116, I want to just read some of the verses, and then we'll go back to 116. Because we did some of this the last time again. On page 117, verse 20, any object intended for reclining upon when a woman is menstruant, upon which she reclines during her period of menstrual separation, will thereby become ritually defiled, and any object intended for sitting upon which she sits will thereby become defiled. If she puts her weight on something, that means that she's invested. So touching is one thing, leaning on it is something else, and therefore in these laws of purity and purity, which do not exist, I mean they exist today, but they're not practiced today because we don't have any holy sacred. We have no ability for partaking of sacred foods, going to the temple and so on. In those days, a chair that she sat on, something she leaned on, would have that type of not that there's anything morally wrong with it. Obviously, menstruation is a natural thing, but there would be these laws about how to make sure to bring these things, whatever she leaned on, whatever it was, to be able to bring it back into the ability of allowing to have it touch or bring it into contact with sacred foods. As is the case with a man with a non-seminal discharge, any object upon which a menstruant has reclined or sat transmits ritual defilement even to people and implements as follows. Anyone who touches an object that you reclined upon becomes ritually defiled. In addition, any garments that this person is touching or otherwise wearing while this ritual impurity is being transmitted to him will also become ritually defiled. He must therefore immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water of the mikveh, after which he will remain defiled in the evening, at which time he will become rid of this defilement. 22. Similarly, anyone who touches an object upon which she sat becomes ritually defiled. So if a menstrual woman sat on a chair, and again, in those days when there were these laws, when we had a temple, and then I sat down on that chair, then I would need to go to the mikveh and go through my process before I was able to go into the temple. In addition, any garments that this person is touching or otherwise wearing while this ritual impurity is being transmitted to him also become ritually defiled. Must therefore immerse his garments, immerse himself in the water of a mikveh, after which he will remain ritually defiled until evening, until which time he and his garments will become rid of this defilement. Number 23. Verse 23, even if he reclines or sits indirectly on an object that you reclined upon or sat upon, he still becomes ritually defiled to the same degree as if he had touched the object. Similar to a man with a non-seminal discharge, if she spits on someone and her saliva either touches the person himself or he carries it without touching it, touching a person not with your hand but with your bodily fluids, he and his garments, as wearing the time become ritually impure, must be immersed in a mixer, after which they remain defiled until evening, at which time they become rid of this defilement. Furthermore, if someone carries her saliva, her menstrual blood, or urine, or in other words, bodily fluids, or objects upon which she reclines, sat, or rode, both he and any garments he is wearing at the time become ritually impure and must be immersed in a mikveh, after which they remain defiled until the evening, at which time they become rid of this defilement. Also, with regard to any part of a saddle other than the seat, meaning the pommel or the cantle, if she leans on it without sitting on it, and then someone touches it, only he himself becomes ritually defiled, not his garments. Thus, he is only required to immerse himself in a mikveh and wait until evening in order to become rid of this defilement. He does not have to immerse his garments. In contrast, if she merely touches an object, even an object made for reclining or sitting, the touched object transmits defilement only to food and drink, not to people or implements. In addition, however, the stringency regarding earthenware vessels that applies to a man with a non-seminal discharge also applies to a menstrual. If she moves such a vessel indirectly, it becomes ritually defiled. Okay, so now let's go to 116. So that's Hasidic insights at the top. So we said there's menstrual blood and non-menstrual blood. A woman has a regular period, but then there can be bleeding not as part of the regular bleeding. These two types of blood and the ritual defilement they impart. Again, the Torah is not at all saying that there's anything wrong with menstruating. That's natural. It's nature. What the Torah is saying is that these are all expressions of they exist because of what happened in the Garden of Eden. We're not Adam, we're not Eve, but we're human, and we have the challenges that are part of being human, and part of which were some of them were imparted to us by Adam and Eve. And one of those challenges is about our sense of self-indulgence, our sense of ego, the challenge for clarity in how we see the world and our purpose in the world and the purpose of the things we use in our world. So the blood is representative of that. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with menstruating, but the blood reminds us of a deeper problem we have, not a biological one, but a psychospiritual one. Parallel two types of discharges men experience, and men have the same thing, seminal and non-seminal. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, there's something right about the semen, and it's a creative force, all that. But it brings to mind our struggle with our own self-gratification and with the confusion that it brings to the world. And the ritual defilement they impart as described above. Now, getting to the female bleeding. The laws of female bleeding, just like the laws of male emissions, take us back to the dawn of human history and remind us how much our lives are products of the incident with the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the resultant expulsion from the Garden of Eden. This is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge means knowing, but knowledge in biblical thing means connecting. It means bonding. So the idea is that whereas Adam and Eve would have known there's something called evil out there, and they would have had to do whatever they could to help ward it off, they didn't have these internal feelings. They didn't internalize evil until they ate from the fruit. It was not part of their system. The system was much more pristine, and dealing with evil was a more external thing. By partaking in the world and ingesting something for a more selfish reason, what they did was they created that sense of disequilibrium, where there's battle internally between being selfless and selfish, being visionary, being surrendered to God, and doing what we want. So that was that confusion, internal, that became now an internal confusion. It wouldn't have been confusion if it stayed out external. Good, and the resultant expulsion from the Garden of Eden, therefore, they were no longer fit to live as pristine a place as the Garden of Eden, and we must continually strive to reverse the consequences of these events until reality is consummately spiritually healed with a final messianic redemption. So we're working against that now. Part of the pain that was introduced into the process of pregnancy on account of the incident with the tree of knowledge is the menstrual cycle. Part of what we brought into the world was this idea, this menstrual cycle. As was explained in our discussion of the primordial sin way back in the book of Genesis, it is specifically the feminine side of our sakis, our drive to concretize divine inspiration, thereby transforming the world into God's home that is most susceptible to the enticements of evil. Okay, so here, and this is an important thing for us to understand as we delve into this. When we say feminine, here we're not necessarily talking female. We're talking about spirituality. Men also have a feminine side and women have a masculine side because we're created by God and we reflect both. Obviously, within a woman, the feminine side is more pronounced, and that skill is probably a more accessible tool. And within men, the masculinity would be the same, more accessible, more defined. But femininity does not necessarily mean females here. So I have, as a man, if I am very attuned and to what's going on around me in the physical world, and I'm actually, certainly compared to my wife, I'm not as attuned to all the nuances of what's going on within the environment and some of the subtler subscripts of what's going on. So from there, as a man, that ability would be my feminine, the feminine spirituality of my soul, the feminine dimension of my soul. The feminine is seen as being engaged, very present, and present for a good purpose, to try and make the best we can that we can of this world. So we say it is specifically the feminine side of our psyches, and that's our drive to concretize divine inspiration. So what we're trying to do is to bring divine inspiration into the world, where we're connected with the world, to understand the world, and we're trying to elevate it, thereby transforming the world into God's home that is the most susceptible to the attachments of evil. The challenge with that feminine side is that since it's engaged, so first of all, there can be a different, if engaged, we can be enticed by the world. And since we're engaged, we notice some of the things that bother us too. Maybe it's going to trigger temper. So being very engaged in the world is a good thing, period. But it does bring challenges, because being engaged means you notice the frustrating things too. And you'll notice slights, and we'll notice some attractive things that maybe my masculine side would have kind of just bypassed. So the femininity, each masculinity has its challenges, and my femininity has its challenge. But this challenge is that since it's engaged in the physical world, it can be tripped up by the physical world. In order to rectify this susceptibility, the woman, and through her husband, whose life is also affected by his wife's menstrual cycle, must be periodically reminded of their own fallibility as God's partners in creation. So even though now you have the woman and her husband, and they, God willing, they're having children, and they're building a life for themselves, and things go along well, and they are God's partners in creation, we can delude ourselves if I have, if we have a good jobs and we're able to support ourselves and life seems to be going well, who needs God? So, and especially since I want to engage in the world, and in my worldly affairs, things seem to be working well. So that engagement in the worldly affairs, it doesn't partner well with God consciousness. So we have to, specifically the feminine side is who's aware that feminine side has to be much more, and is by nature more able to tap into the godliness, the divinity, so that it can balance its very present human side with the recognition that we live in God's world. So one physical reminder that the woman has, and that translates to her husband through her, is the menstrual cycle. That once a month, we're reminded of our own fallibility. This is all because, this dates back to Grandma Eve, and I got to be careful not to fall into the trap of self-absorption. The potentially heady sense of self that can result from partaking in the miracle of bearing a new human being, onto 117 on the right, which serves as the archetype for propagating divine consciousness throughout creation in general. So a woman literally and physically can create bring new souls to the world, bring a new consciousness and godliness, and change the physical world. The bearing of a baby, there's no greater example of creation than that, and our partnership with God in being creators. So that, especially, that can, they're calling it heady, that we can really get very swept up in our own place in the world and the beauty of it. Must be attenuated by being reminded of human limitations. So in that area itself of what the human body gives forth, and the ovulation, which is the power of being able to create, which is so incredible and uplifting, spiritually uplifting. Torah then attenuates that by having menstruation as we expel the ovulation, because it's a reminder that we are privileged to be very well spiritually endowed agents of God, but we're agents of God, and not to get carried away with ourselves. Thus, by means of the menstrual cycle, wife and husband are humbled into acknowledging the need to submit to God's will when fulfilling his mission on earth. So that reminds us, and therefore it's an important biological reminder that God hardwired into the human experience. In this case, it's the feminine human experience, but something for, God willing, a woman as she gets married, and she's focusing on the beauty of creating life. This is a reminder that ultimately we have to focus not so much on what it does for us, but the fact that we are God's agents in the world. We also noted that the sin of Adam and Eve was presaged by the diminution of the moon, which resulted in its monthly cycle waxing and waning. The fact that the woman's menstrual cycle occurs in specifically monthly periods alludes to its origin in the lunar cycle. So this is something that I think we've discussed in the past, that in the unfolding of creation, God creates a world. So everything's the infinite, and God creates the finite, creates an other. Me and you will feel ourselves as we are totally independent of God, and then we can work with our minds and our hearts and our souls to recognize that we're not so independent of God, but our human default position is that I exist and I wasn't created. I don't even feel born. That we exist. That sense of non-created existence, and we work to try to humble. So how did we get from a purely divine world to a situation where a few days after creation, humans can feel so independent as to violate God's command and eat from that fruit? So one of the things that the Kabbalah tells us is that God set up humans for this mistake. In other words, gave us that sense of self, and because if we were totally wrapped up within God, this wouldn't have happened. And this is symbolized by what happened a few days before the creation of humanity, in the creation or in the arrangement of the sun and the moon. So in the sun and the moon, the language in the Torah is a little funky, where it talks about the two great luminaries, meaning the sun and the moon, and then it says the great one, the sun, and the small one, the reflector, the moon. So first it's called great, and then they're both called great, and then they're split up. So the Talmud tells us, gives us in a metaphoric story. It says that the moon complained to God and says that two kings can't wear one crown. It's, we can't both be great. Who's going to be dominant? And God said, "You're right. So I'm going to diminish you, and you'll just be a reflector." Commentators tell us that the moon would have been translucent, in which case we'd always be able to see what smaller means, that smaller in size, and that it's not luminous. The idea, though, is that God put out there that there is the luminary, that's the sun in our experience, or if you want to talk about it in the spiritual metaphor, that's God. Obviously, the sun's not God, but God is the luminary. And then there's the ability for us, or the moon, but us, we are the moon, to be a recipient and of God's illumination, and to be luminaries in and of ourselves. The fact that God diminished the moon and made it this cycle where it's not fully luminous, and it waxes and wanes. There are times when, on the 15th of the Hebrew month, it's in full glory. We can see it as a full recipient of the sun's illumination. And there are other times when it's not, when it's dark. As a matter of fact, right before birth is when it's darkest. We can't see it. So that is all an important illustration for us as humans of us, that God created it with the idea of diminishing the moon. God diminished the human experience in the sense that it made it not as easily aligned and as naturally aligned with God, so that we're not. It's not. We're just gonna wake up in the morning and say, "Wow, I'm alive in God's world, and it's my job and my privilege to be able to be reflecting divinity to the world." That's not the way we wake up. Whatever, not that we wake up bad, but it's usually about what's on our mind, what the day is. Probably some of yesterday's aggravation. So this is the moon, and the waxing and the waning of the moon is a symbol, and that's why we have a lunar calendar. Symbolizes our struggle for alignment with the divine. And that's what they say over here, because the moon represents that, and the idea of the diminishment of the moon is what led to the enough diminishment in the human condition of being totally aligned with God, that they were able to actually say, "Look at that fruit, and it's going to taste good for us," then, and not think about what God had in mind. It showed a diminution of the moon, so to speak, because we are the moon. So, and that's what we say, the woman's menstrual cycle occurs in specifically monthly periods, that alludes to its origin in the lunar cycle. Now, normal menstrual bleeding renders the woman ritually defiled to a limited extent, as we will see. So there's the normal flow, and the normal flow, again, is totally normal and biological. There's nothing wrong with it, but because it brings to mind our own fallibility, there is this time when the woman cannot. It's a 7-day period, no matter how long her flow is, and because it's not going to go past 7 days usually. But so no matter how long the flow, at the end of the 7 days, she's back in the game. She can go to the mikveh, and she can go into the temple. So it's to a limited extent. The extent of this form of ritual defilement and its accompanying purification process is typically enough to restore the couple to the normal divine consciousness. So we say, okay, so there's I as a human being, us as a couple, we have this struggle with sense of self. Some of it is being reflected by the fact that the woman has this menstrual cycle, which reminds us what went on in the Garden of Eden. It's obviously it's my wife's situation, but it's a reminder to us both. I also share femininity, and we both have to pay some attention to the fact that if left to our own devices, we can get carried away with our own self-importance and our pursuit of pleasures of the world. So the regular process is enough to balance us, until it is necessary to repeat the cycle the following month. Another month, every once in a while, we need reminders. Right? We pray 3 times a day because we need reminders, and this is once a month. The idea of the menstruation is an important reminder of what happened in the Garden of Eden. This periodic cleansing of the existential venom of the primordial snake that was injected into our psyches when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit will continue until God causes spirit of impurity to pass away from the earth. So this is the idea now we're using, morning Lori, using different framing. It's not only that the fact it's all the same, but the idea of the self-indulgence and the self-absorption that was practiced and on display with Adam and Eve in wanting to eat from the fruit because it was luscious to the eyes. That say who enticed her? The serpent. A serpent is not morally evil. A serpent's an animal, but the serpent does represents this idea of this attraction in the world to just do what you want, do what makes you feel good, do what you enjoy, and don't worry about it. And that pursuit of what we think will give us pleasure is one of our biggest challenges in life. And some of the biggest mistakes we make is when we're not thinking what's the best for us, for our relationships, or our family. We're doing what feels good, seems to feel good right now. So that's the we're going to call that the serpent, or the force of the serpent seducing them to do the wrong thing, and their own sense of moral confusion when they just want to do something that feels good for them. So the monthly period is a time that for the woman and for her husband to just recognize that, to remember what happened in the Garden of Eden, because we say that when Mashiach comes, there will no longer be the need for that reminder. So menstruation will cease. But that's a normal reminder. Like we daven 3 times a day as a reminder to try and remember our place we pray 3 times a day to remember our place in the world. But here we spoke about something called also non-menstrual bleeding. And non-menstrual bleeding, if it goes up for more than 3 days, it's actually more. You finish, and then you have to have 7 clean days before you can get back, into a normal rhythm in the marriage and going to the temple. So what does that represent? Non-menstrual bleeding, in contrast, the result of an abnormally inflated feminine ego. Now, again, feminine ego does not mean a female thing. It means that part of us that is very connected to the world, very present in the world, and feels and senses what's going on, senses the opportunities, senses the beauty, senses the problems, sometimes sensing the problems will challenge our temper and our patience and all of that. So that's both for men and for women. Is this? We said that's a challenge we all have, and the monthly cycle reminds us that we shouldn't get too wrapped up in our place in the world, but recognize that we're here for God, and be able to focus on that, and not get so much wrapped up in our own feelings and our appetites and pulls in the world. Appetite can be, temper is also an appetite. But no, what about non-menstrual bleeding? Say this is an abnormally inflated ego, in which the self-assurance that should have been humbled by the menstrual cycles instead fed by presumptuous and repeatedly overstepping the bounds of God's will. So what does this represent? Again, these are biological things, but what do they represent to us spiritually? They represent to us spiritually the bleeding where we have not been properly humbled by the normal flow, monthly flow, and reminded that there's this idea of the danger in the world of absorption, self-absorption, which the menstruation and similar to the semen, but the menstruation will represent. That wasn't enough to humble us. So now there's a non-menstrual cycle, non-menstrual bleeding. So in other words, the self-assurance that should have been humbled by the menstrual cycle, it didn't help me. This sinful hubris elicits uterine bleeding, the reminder of human frailty before its scheduled resumption, resulting in a more serious extent of ritual defilement, necessitating a full week of purgation followed by sacrificial rites. So, since the natural flow of menstruation reminds me and my wife of the problem, the challenge that we have with self-absorption and looking and the enticements of physical enjoyment that will take us away from what we really need to do in life. The menstruation reminds me of that because it traces back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That wasn't enough, and it didn't humble me. I got used to the natural flow. Every month she has a period. So it's when things happen regularly, we often don't take them consciously. So now there's something that comes not normal. If there's a not normal flow, it's to remind us, say, something you're not getting the message of the humility and the surrender to God that we have to feel in God's world. Here again, together with its warning against reinforcing anti-divine consciousness through transgressing God's will, the Torah informs us that the power of repentance is such, that even someone who has internalized evil to this extent can still be rehabilitated. So Torah says, okay, so you got carried away with all the pleasures of the world, but there's a way forward. So, Yolanda, you had some questions before. You have anything to add to this? Okay, so we'll go on.
Sorry, I said I'm confused by that paragraph.
Okay, you're confused by the paragraph.
Yes.
What do you hear it saying?
Well, I hear it say that no menstrual bleeding is what's the part about the ego?
Yes, so it represents something.
And I'm not inflated feminine ego. So if I'm having no menstrual bleeding, I'm gonna say to the doctor.
I'm sorry. If you have non-menstrual bleeding, you do what?
If I have a no menstrual bleeding, should I abide by this or go to the doctor to see what's wrong with me?
Well, it doesn't. First of all, I don't think non-menstrual bleeding is something for a doctor necessarily, because I think it happens, just from my experience, not my experience, my experience with my wife. But it's what it's saying is, and again, this is representative. It's not. It's talking about the lessons we have in life from about our purpose in life, and we go back to Adam and Eve and how their experience and how it resonates with us. So there is nothing morally wrong with menstruating, and there's nothing morally wrong with non-menstrual bleeding. Those are they're either it's the body doing something, and sometimes we have to go to see a doctor. I don't know. We're not talking about it as a physical illness or a physical problem. Saying that it reflects. The idea reflects has a spiritual message for us. Menstruation in general has a message for us that it came. God introduced that into the world because Adam and Eve put their own pleasure above what God wanted. So God said, so you're going to want the pleasure of having a child. It's not going to come as simply as it would have. You'll have the pain. There will be the discomfort of menstruation is going to be part of that's biological system that helps you produce the greatest gift, the idea of a child. So it's when a woman menstruates, that they don't believe that God is somehow punishing them for something. That's nature. But the idea that menstrual bleeding exists is a reminder of what happened in the Garden of Eden. It's a reminder for women, it's a reminder for men. The idea of non-menstrual bleeding points out to us that sometimes the message of menstrual bleeding isn't enough because we don't hear the messages. Because it's natural. A mezuzah has a message for me. But if I'm walking through doorways with mezuzahs the whole day, I can become immune to it. So sometimes God throws in, and nature throws in, these unusual things which do attract our attention. It's non-menstrual bleeding. It's not according to my cycle. That remind us, not just women, men and women, that in our attempt to engage the world, which is called a feminine attempt, because females are considered more with a firmer grasp on what's going on in the surroundings than men, even though men are not idiots, but there's a certain natural talent to pick up nuances of what's going on. So, but being very engaged with the world means you're not higher than the world. Although you want to be able to be transcendent too, but this is not. This is what we would call immanent and connected with the world. When you're in middle of prayer, when you're in middle of meditation, you're less open to less susceptible to different problems and attractions and appetites. But when we're engaged in the world, and we're supposed to be engaged in the world, and our engagement in the world is our feminine side, that brings with it its own hurdles. So the menstrual bleeding represents to us. It doesn't mean that someone with a non-menstrual bleeding did anything wrong, but it does represent to us that the menstrual bleeding is a reminder, but there's sometimes it's not enough because we're so wrapped up in ourselves, not thinking about God, that God has to send us a message, even not in the normal cycle, that look what happened with Adam and Eve. Remember, the fruit may look luscious, but before you eat it, think about God. That's what it's saying over here. Does that help?
Somewhat, because I did go through this, and I need medical attention. I ended up in surgery. So
so it struck. It strikes. Again, it's a trigger. It's not. Well, I hope you're well. It's
yeah.
not. It's not talking about. It's certainly not in any way drawing a spiritual reasoning for what you may have gone through, and I hope you're okay with that. In the flow of how women operate. Again, I'm married, and we have to pay attention to that. There's a normal cycle, and sometimes there's spotting. Sometimes, and we pay very much attention to that because how the blood comes out, because it does matter. So there's the idea of a woman bleeding in a way that doesn't need medical attention, and maybe they don't even notice it much. But unless they're paying attention, and in Jewish law we're paying attention, that is not necessarily. That's a pretty normal abnormality, and not one that needs medical attention.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so verse 24, you'll be taught later that it's forbidden to engage in carnal relations with a menstruant. If a man nonetheless does engage in carnal relations with her, go to 118. I'm sorry, no, not 118, 117 on the right. The ritual defilement caused by her menstruation will be transmitted to him, and he will be defiled for 7 days, counting from the day on which they conducted relations, regardless of on which day of her 7-day count they occurred. Will become defiled exactly in the same way she is defiled. Any object intended for reclining upon which he reclines will therefore thereby become defiled, and so forth, as just stated. 118. As we closing on the end of this Torah portion. We will now discuss the ritual defilement that a woman contracts from non-menstrual bleeding. If a woman bleeds for only 1 day or 2 consecutive days during her 11-day non-menstrual span and then passes 1 full day clear of bleeding, she may immerse herself in a mikveh on that clear day, in other words, clear of blood, after which she becomes rid of this defilement. On the evening following her immersion, she is permitted to eat all consecrated foods to which she is entitled, including sacrificial meat, and to enter the tabernacle precincts. If, however, her bleeding continues for 3 or more consecutive days, the law is different. A woman whose discharge of uterine blood flows for more than 2 days, meaning a minimum of 3 days, and these 3 or more days occur outside of but immediately following the 7-day span of her menstrual separation, or she has a discharge of blood for 3 or more days after the 7-day span of her menstrual separation, but removed from it by between 1 and 10 intervening days, then in either such case she'll be ritually defiled all the days of her defiling discharge in the same manner that she is ritually defiled during the days of her menstrual separation. Thus, any object intended for reclining upon which she reclines throughout the duration of a discharge will be treated with regard to becoming defiled and defiling other entities the same way as an object intended for reclining upon is treated during her period of menstrual separation. Similarly, any object intended for sitting upon which she sits will thereby become defiled in the same way such an object becomes defiled during her period of menstrual defilement. Anyone who touches such objects will become ritually defiled. In addition, any garments that this person is touching or otherwise wearing while this ritual impurity is being transmitted to him also become ritually defiled. He must therefore immerse his garments and immerse himself in the water of the mikveh, after which he will remain defiled until evening, at which time he will become rid of this defilement. If she becomes rid of her discharge, meaning the discharge clearly ceases, she must count for herself 7 consecutive days during which she remains free of any discharge. That's only in the case of this abnormal. After this, she may immerse herself in the mikvah on the 7th day, and thus become undefiled, and that she will no longer defile anyone or anything else, and she may consume truma if she's entitled to. Truma is a tithe given to the Kohen, but she may still not consume sacrificial meat or enter the tabernacle precincts. And then the final, on the 8th day, she must take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest after coming with them to the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest must sacrifice them, one as a sin offering and the other as an scent offering, and thus the priest will effect atonement for her before God from the defilement of her discharge. She may then consume her sacrificial meat and enter the tabernacle precincts. So now, in the final 3 verses of the Torah, the Torah caps this off, and there's a point that it has been kind of hammered home in the past 2.5 Torah portions. Because remember, we started this all off with the dedication of the tabernacle, place of holiness, and then we got into kosher laws, and we got into this. And in the kosher laws too, there is a very clear scriptural focus and emphasis on making distinctions in life between what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. In today's day, in the society, from what I can tell, that's getting a little less accepted, that we can call anything inappropriate. But there is the Torah makes it very clear that part of life, part of our mission to undo the confusion that Adam and Eve introduced into the world is to define, say this is permitted, this is not, this is appropriate, that's not. It's without getting offensive or obnoxious about it, saying that's not appropriate, it's not appropriate. For me, my moral code, whatever it may be, but we have to make distinctions. So that was underscored when it came to what we eat, that not everything is okay. Again, it doesn't mean that a pig or a shellfish is somehow a morally problematic being. It means it's not appropriate for my soul. And here also there are things that are even in the natural flow, we make distinctions of when there of different times and situations where we're open to godliness and we're not. So it says you must thus separate. Tell the court you must thus separate the Israelites from their defilements. They may not die on account of the defilement as part of the punishment of excision for defiling my sanctuary, which is in the midst by entering it while ritually defiled. If I was ritually defiled and went into the temple, then on a soul level, I've really hurt myself, God forbid. And so you have to separate them from that, but really it means also it makes distinctions in our lives. Say there are times when we can have physical intimacy, and then there are times we can't. It's called discipline and definition. 32. The following is a summary of the law pertaining to a man who has no abnormal discharge. This type of ritual defilement includes several cases, which we will now list in the order of increasing severity. First is that of a man who has a single abnormal discharge. Defilement contracted by a man who has a single abnormal discharge, the same as that of a man who has a seminal emission. This single discharge causes him to become defiled only for the rest of that day, during which he may immerse himself in a mikveh, after which he remains defiled until evening, at which time he becomes totally rid of this defilement. Laws pertaining to a man who has 2 or more abnormal discharges were given above. And the final verse is the other cases of ritual defilement contracted from bodily discharges are in order of increasing severity: a menstruating woman, someone who has an abnormal discharge, followed by a second or third abnormal discharge, with a male or female, and a man who engages in carnal relations with a defiled woman, all of whose laws were given above. So we are now up to the overview. This finishes the 2 Torah portions that we went through of a lot of interesting, funky ritual stuff. And now we're going to be moving into also other ritual stuff, but it's going to be more of a narrative to it. So I wish you all a great week, and see you.